Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. What's good, y'all? We are back with this week's edition of Coffee with Comrades, and I am legitimately so excited to share this episode with you. As always, if you enjoy this podcast, please consider supporting Coffee with Comrades by going to patreon.com/Coffee with Comrades. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep Coffee with Comrades afloat and unlock exclusive first access, download bonus episodes that have yet to be released, join our Discord, and more. I know $1 doesn't sound like a lot, but every little bit adds up. Your monthly gesture of mutual aid helps this program stay afloat. If you have the means, please consider supporting the independent media and artists that you love. If you can't become a patron, no worries. You can still help out Coffee with Comrades by rating and reviewing the show in iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you go to get your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter and smash that RT button whenever a new episode comes out. And, most importantly, tell your friends and comrades about this podcast if you like what you hear. Coffee with Comrades is a proud affiliate of the Rev Left Radio Federation and the Channel Zero Network. Check out this jingle from our homies on the CZN, The Final Straw.
The Final Straw is a weekly anarchist radio show. It's fucking awesome, and you're never going to hear me say fucking awesome on our show because we're FCC regulated.
There's a black part of my heart that just flutters when you talk like that.
Talk, then more yelling.
It's a weird sort of like nice thing in a way, but also can get kind of crushing at times.
thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Alright, like I said, I am absolutely amped for this edition of the program. Today's episode is the first half of another two-part special on leftist gun culture. So, without further ado, please enjoy episode 70 of Coffee with Comrades, SRAid.
I'm fed up by this analog Twitter feed. If I unfollow you, will you forget all about me? Like making art with a paintbrush and all the strokes that go unnoticed. Or when your friends pretend you're joking, even though they know that your heart is broken. Don't you dare compare yourself to anyone but you. Don't you dare compare yourself to anyone but you.
Well, on this week's show, two of my lovely comrades from the Socialist Rifle Association are joining me for a discussion. Faye and Oso, it's so good to have you both on the program. Welcome on Coffee with Comrades, y'all.
Definitely. Glad to be here.
Yeah, for sure. Well, today we're bringing listeners the first of a special two-part series on lefty gun culture. But first, for folks who may not already be aware of who y'all are, would you mind taking a second to just introduce yourselves for me?
Sure. I'm Faye. I'm the vice president and co-founder of the Socialist Rifle Association, and I also run the SRAid podcast.
And I'm Oso, and I'm a member of the Socialist Rifle Association, and I do some mutual aid and community defense.
Beautiful. Well, longtime listeners of Coffee with Comrades will be familiar with today's topic of discussion. Way back in episode 15, Solidarity, Not Charity, we talked with Jimmy Dunson, the founder of Mutual Aid Disaster Relief and one of my really dear friends and comrades. And then in episode 31, We Keep Us Safe, Faye joined us for a chat about the SRA. So I'm really excited because today's edition of the show is basically a fusion of these two themes. We've been in talks to do a conversation on SRA's mutual aid projects for quite a while now, and I guess a good place to maybe start is by asking the obvious question. It might be kind of a no-brainer for the three of us, but for folks who hear, SRA and think, oh, that's something about guns, how did the SRA kind of get into doing mutual aid work, especially in the wake of disaster relief?
Well, the SRA's idea of community defense was pretty heavily inspired by the Black Panthers and the community defense that they did out in Oakland. And so the Black Panthers really saw community defense as more than just, cop watching and open carrying rifles, which definitely is community defense. It is very good praxis. But they also saw it as defending their community from the ravages of capitalism. So they would do things like, feeding school children, helping out the homeless and poorer families in their community. So early on, when we were looking into ways that the SRA could do community defense beyond just firearms education, disaster relief was something that was pretty heavily discussed. And when Hurricane Florence hit the Carolinas, we sprang into action, started up a fundraiser. The first action we raised around $1,300, and we did our first disaster relief action. And Oso was actually one of the people who spearheaded that on the ground.
Hell yeah! What can you tell us about that, Oso?
Sure. It was a pretty good opportunity to get involved with some of the local comrades that, basically we had only had a few range days, and we weren't, everything was still pretty new. So I was able to meet up with Alex, our president, and she came all the way from Kansas and drove out, and we went, loaded up the truck with supplies that she had brought, and we had to basically search our way through and find places to distribute those goods. It wasn't. It was kind of a learning experience for us all on that first trip.
Well, what did you learn?
We learned that we should be doing this mutual aid for communities and not organizations. Not bringing supplies to Red Cross and things like that. We should be bringing them, to community centers that are, based in the communities affected, not just like NGO and all of that.
Totally.
Yeah, the first time out, we tried to interface with the Red Cross, and they were very unhelpful, but they did give us a list of shelters that Oso and Alex could drop supplies off at. This was actually, they went down right before the storm hit, dropped off supplies at some shelters that were understocked, and then drove back to Georgia with the storm close on their heels. But the Red Cross does some good work, but it is very much, that sort of bureaucratic, self-interested, nonprofit industrial complex sort of organization. So in future, we focused a lot more on interfacing with grassroots community groups and also working with mutual aid disaster relief.
Totally. And I mean, the logic there checks out, right? Because the whole idea is, we're not trying to empower the nonprofit industrial complex to take care of people, right? We're trying to empower ourselves and empower one another. And so, trying to find those people, though, can be a hard thing, right? I mean, it's one thing to say that we're for solidarity, not charity. It's much harder to actually do the nuts and bolts and do the networking required in order to find these groups on the ground in any given context or any given community.
Yeah, and I feel like we're in a better position now that we've had, a few runs to, know who folks are in these grassroots, community groups. Whereas, the first time, we're kind of feeling around for ourselves. And now, we've reached out to like mutual aid, disaster relief, and folks like yourself that was down there in Florida. I think we've made a lot of headway in the whole mutual aid, but it being independent,
Yeah, for sure. Well, listen, Faye, as the vice president of the SRA, you kind of have an inside look at how things are run. And so I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about how the resources that the SRA has kind of devoted towards these projects. Why was this a priority, not just for the Central Committee, but also for the rank and file of the Socialist Rifle Association?
Disaster relief is really important because it's sort of a dry run of the lessons that you learn doing disaster relief can be applied to all kinds of emergency not just hurricanes or fires, but also, if civil conflict or other issues in the United States were to spiral out of control, the sort of coordination and, interfacing with people on the ground is very important for people to have a grasp of. And also, disasters are going to get more common in the future as climate change gets worse. I mean, hurricanes have been getting more intense and dumping more rainfall as the climate gets hotter. The wildfires in California in 2018 and now the brush fires in Australia this year have demonstrated just the deteriorating conditions that we live in. It's going to be a lot more important for people to help those affected by disasters in the future, because the government doesn't really have the resources to be able to do it effectively. And even when they do have the resources, they often choose not to use them based on racist or nationalist ideas and beliefs. So I think that any socialist organization worth its salt needs to be preparing for disaster relief and other ways of dealing with climate change. And for an organization like us that's focused on community defense, I think that disaster relief is one of the best ways that we can contribute.
Yeah, well said. And we're definitely going to dig into some of that stuff here in just a minute. But before we do, Oso, you and I first met when you drove down from Georgia with a trailer full of supplies to help folks who'd been impacted by Hurricane Michael, which barreled into the Florida Panhandle in October 2018. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about that experience? You jumped in a trailer, had a bunch of stuff, and then drove down here. What was that like? And specifically, what happened to the trailer? Because there's kind of a funny story there as well.
Well, it wasn't so funny. It's kind of funny, but
it's maybe it's funny in retrospect. It certainly wasn't funny in the moment, I'm sure.
Yeah. That time, we loaded up in the Costco, and some of the comrades from the local chapter of SRAid helped, get supplies. And in fact, one of the comrade from Tallahassee area that was up here because they were escaping the storm, also helped out with the whole Costco run. But once we loaded up, I mean, it was, I want to say, about 1,500 pounds in the truck, I want to guess. I regularly load that truck up about that much, so I could tell by the way it handles, I guess. Anyway, I got started coming down there, and it was just me by myself. Nobody was really available, at that short a notice, I guess, at that point. So it was just me, myself, and I. And I started down, and immediately, I mean, barely 5 miles from the Costco, the truck started having some issues, wanted to die. So I stopped in the auto parts store, and because I had an idea what was wrong, and I got some sealant, and I sealed up the problem, and it seemed to be okay and held up. So I proceeded down to Florida, and I drove down there pretty much straight, only stopping to eat lunch at the Denny's. And once I got down past middle Georgia, the plan was to stop at another comrade's place in South Georgia to see about their damage. And they actually didn't have anything dire that needed help. They had it all handled themselves. So I kept heading down south to Florida. And once I got past, I want to say it was Valdosta area of Georgia, it got real, you can see it on the highway on 75, just, the signs were blown to pieces, and billboards were just torn apart, and people's fences were down, and it started to look real like a storm had hit. And then once I got down into the top part of Florida, it was even more devastation. Like, trees were down. I had to, cross power lines that were crossing the road, and there was no fuel in parts of North Florida. I couldn't get fuel at some stations. Not for that they were out. There was no power. And that's what I noticed to be the really bad problem, was there was no power for a lot of different, things. And I was a little bit worried about that because the truck was having issues, and I didn't want to get stuck somewhere and, there was, not going to be any help, no shop that I could, get some repairs at, But I kept going down there, and I got into Tallahassee just at dark. And all the street lights, the signals had generators powering them, and there wasn't a lot of power. I mean, some people had some, and I noticed that there was looked like some help had come from to charge cell phones. There was some people there, I think it was T-Mobile had a trailer where you can come get your cell phone charged. But I headed over to what is the place?
The Florida PAC, the Florida People's Advocacy Center?
Yes, the Florida PAC. And I got there, and it was completely dark. But I met with some nice people there, and they helped me unload the truck. And I stuck around for a little while, just, catch my breath. And I was planning on staying initially and helping the next day, but because of the problems with the truck, I didn't want to stay stranded. So I only hung around for a couple hours and then decided to head back home.
But you and I got to meet, which was cool.
Yeah, it was. It was good talking with you, and that was the first time you and I met, and I met also Shelby, I think.
Yeah, Shelby's the best. I love Shelby. She's so awesome.
And it was good to meet everyone down there. That's one of the things that I really enjoy, is getting to talk with people that I have never met, and so that, I mean, even in a disaster, I mean, there is little rays of light,
Absolutely.
But so I turn around after a short break, turn around and headed back home, and I got 40 miles from my house, and the truck just died, completely died, shut off, and just nothing. Which was pretty bad. It was about 2:00 in the morning.
Worst possible time for it to happen.
Yeah. No kidding. And so I sat there, I called, for a tow, and I called, and no tows showed up for an hour, and then 2 hours, and 3 hours, and just I couldn't understand. I was like, well, maybe it's because it's late, who knows. Well, finally at about 6:30 in the morning, a tow truck shows up, gets my truck loaded up, and away we go. We get about a quarter of a mile down the highway, and the tow truck died.
That's why this story is ridiculous. It's not funny, but it's ridiculous. What are the fucking odds, dude? What are the odds that would happen? That's just so, you go out of your way to try and help folks. You drive all the way down from North Georgia, all the way down to the Florida Panhandle, and then this bullshit happens. It's just the universe is cruel sometimes.
Sometimes.
I'd forgotten that happened, but I remember texting with Oso at the time and him being very, very distraught.
Yeah, understandably so.
It was no fun, and I was tired, you can't hardly sleep on the freeway. And yeah, so the tow truck died. So they ordered another one up, and then they had to figure out how to get my truck off of one tow truck to another tow truck. They had to call a third tow truck, a special, I don't know, some kind of heavy duty, with a crane kind of shit. And I mean, they didn't use any of that equipment. They just backed the two up together. But the guy driving the crane tow truck was, I guess, more of an engineer than the other two tow truck drivers, and was able to figure out how to move it across. I mean, there was a good, I don't know, foot gap between the tow trucks that they had to figure out how to breach. And Oh, it was something else. It was something else.
Yeah, that sounds like a true and utter nightmare. Well, for what it's worth, comrade, those supplies went to help folks who were desperately in need. So, obviously, I know it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. I greatly appreciated it, and those supplies were greatly appreciated by the people in rural Florida who got hit by Hurricane Michael. So I'm sorry for your suffering, but I'm also grateful for your sacrifice.
It was my pleasure, and I'd happily do it again, even with the broken truck.
Yeah, for sure. Well, listen, like Faye brought up earlier, our current epoch is one of anthropogenic climate change, right? We're in a moment that is absolutely exacerbated by capitalist excess, and climate-related disasters are increasingly becoming not so natural anymore. Confronting these crises is going to continue to be a really central crux of leftist organizing pretty much for the foreseeable future. So I'm curious, why did the two of you think that the SRA, a educational organization that's rooted in community defense, is uniquely poised to address these ongoing catastrophes and lend material support to those directly impacted by the worst effects of climate change?
Well, from my view, it's not really about position so much as who else on the left was doing this work. So the closest, at least that was publicly doing it at the time, was Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, doing coordination in the Carolinas for Hurricane Florence, and then in Puerto Rico as well. But aside from that, at the time, we didn't really hear much about this from other organizations unless they were immediately in the disaster zone. And, at least from my perspective, I thought it was important to have national solidarity. And, hopefully one day we can have international solidarity as well, to a larger degree. To help our comrades and to help, marginalized people who might be, left behind by the traditional support structures. In Florida, I remember there was a great deal of concern that, undocumented immigrants couldn't go to some of the shelters or supply locations in the wake of Hurricane Michael for fear that ICE agents might be camping out in front of those locations. So if those people don't have access to traditional, state level support structures, then who else is there to support them? And so I thought, the SRA, again, because of that broad definition of community defense, it seemed like a natural fit. If no one else was doing this work, then someone needed to do it, and we were positioned to step in.
Hell yeah.
Well, the first time that we did this, was more we should do something. I think everybody kind of felt like, we were in a position of privilege where we could, take what we could and go down to the Carolinas actually and go and help, for me personally, there was no second thought about it. I thought, we should just do this because, people there, they need our help. And if we're not affected in the same manner, and there are people that are without power, don't have the food or water or whatever, we can just do it. We can help them. Let's just go. As you say, do shit.
Fuck theory, do shit.
Yeah, fuck theory, fuck theory, do shit. Yeah, no, for sure. Well, I mean, it's one of those things too where I think a lot of times when a disaster hits, right, people are really paralyzed, they're really scared, but they're also, they want to go help, they want to do something, right? There's something really powerful about the human experience where you suffer the brunt of a disaster and it actually winds up pulling people closer together. I mean, I've seen the same thing again and again happen doing disaster relief work with Mutual Aid Disaster Relief, but I've also seen it in other kinds of tragedies, in the wake of the Pulse shooting in Orlando. There were thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who poured into the streets and who were, donating blood, who were going and getting supplies and things for people who were donating blood, because it was in the middle of June and like people were standing in long lines so that they could donate blood, and people were going out and distributing water and giving them snacks and stuff. I mean, it's truly heartening to see how people band together in the wake of tragedies. And it's one of the things that's kind of always fascinated me, right, is like, we have all this like post-apocalyptic literature and media that would seem to suggest that when the shit hits the fan, people are going to turn on each other and they're going to be cutthroat and bloodthirsty, and it's really soaked in this sort of capitalist ideology, right? But in reality, like, people really band together and try and help one another. As Kropotkin said, mutual aid is a factor of evolution, and I think that's really true, and I've seen it happen with my own eyes, and participated in it in many ways. And I guess I'm really just trying to put kind of the next question that I have for y'all into perspective, because one of the things that I see kind of coming down the pipeline, right, is we've got all these disasters, we've got all of this climate-related catastrophe that is ensuing currently and will continue to ramp up in the years and decades ahead. And we really see two responses, right? We see this, horrifying, fascistic, white supremacist response that says, oh, I'm just going to look out for number one, I'm going to look out for myself and fuck everybody else. And then we have the other response, the more emancipatory, communal response. And I really think that as the United States in particular follows this trajectory of neoliberal capitalism and its various excesses, we're going to see more and more of these disasters, and these disasters are going to lead to contested territory between the right and the left. And in the past, white supremacists have, they've used disasters as an opportunity to roll into these devastated communities and bring supplies, but only donate those supplies to white people. And then they spend their whole time while they're there dressed up as militia fuckheads, rigorously patrolling impacted regions with guns and quite literally hunting for black and brown folks under the auspices of trying to prevent quote-unquote looting. And, this happened in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, and then again in the rural South after Irma and Michael. You have these paramilitary, neo-fascist white supremacists, and then you also have groups like ICE and the CBP and the regular state law enforcement. And I think it's relatively easy to denounce these racist fucksticks for their reprehensible activities, but it's much more difficult, and I think far more important, to try and create meaningful ways to protect and defend our communities. And this is what the SRA is all about, right? It's about community self-defense. And so, I guess I kind of just want to open up to kind of a broader discussion, right, about the future that we're looking at, and what is the, I guess my question for y'all is like, what is the future that y'all want to build? Let's spend some time here at the this part of the episode just kind of thinking and dreaming a little bit about like what are the types of disaster relief and anti-racism and leftist gun culture that we really want to prefigure and bring into the world.
I see us having disaster response trailers fully kitted out and ready to go at a moment's notice, and volunteers, ready to staff them. I would love to see, we are working on one at the SRA. We have our disaster response trailer that we've got, and we need to kit it up and put generators and solar panels and little fridges to keep insulin cold, and we're going to have a gun safe, which I think is important too, because I listened to, I think it was Scott Crow, talk about in Katrina how they set up their clinic and there were white supremacists coming to rob them or whatever, and they had to go hot and get their arms out. Not that the SRA is going to be doing any kind of militia-like activity, but let's be clear, we're going to have the arms with us, and we're not going to let anybody get harmed. That is something that I think is important. So, I mean, I see, from my personal perspective, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of the whole SRA, but I see that we can start, building these resources and network with groups like mutual aid, disaster relief. I think we need to build, solidarity networks and have, build dual power, right? And have our own resources that we can go out and help and not have to rely on FEMA or, Department of Homeland Security or Red Cross or whatever.
Yeah, and I think it's one thing that I would really like to see is the ability for, socialist and left-wing groups within a given area that is affected by a disaster or is, near an area that's affected by a disaster, is for all these different socialist and anarchist groups to be able to get together and work together in a spirit of solidarity to help their community.
Absolutely.
One of the things that was really inspiring about the Michael action in particular was, we had all these sorts of folks from DSA, SRA, apparently there were some PSL folks involved in Tallahassee to distribute this aid and get it out to people who needed it and, deliver these supplies. That sort of inter-organizational cooperation and also being able to work with like the local community groups, I think is really important. We organized for Hurricane Dorian, which thankfully didn't cause much damage in the continental US, but we had a big action for it just in case. Being able to, get on the phone and talk with like a community nonprofit in North Carolina and be able to talk to someone who already has extensive ties to that community, and then to be able to go down there with supplies to help the people who are already embedded in that community rather than being some outside force like FEMA or the Red Cross who come in and sort of dictate the terms of how aid is going to be provided. I think that's really important. There's this whole notion of like disaster communism, right? When the societal structure of the state and capitalism kind of breaks down, people just sort of naturally help each other. And so if there are socialist organizations within that environment, then they should take the role of being an organized form of disaster communism to help those in need. If nothing else, that's practice for the type of society that we should be building, going out with people volunteering according to their ability and handing out supplies to people in accordance with their needs.
Yeah, well said. I mean, one of the things that's always kind of really interested me about this idea of disaster communism or disaster socialism or whatever the fuck you want to call it, there's this interesting kind of connotation, right, where this thing could only happen in the context of a disaster. And I think that obviously the three of us see that that's a fallacious example, and that communism or socialism or anarchism or whatever you would like to call it can and has and will continue to operate outside of the bonds of immediate not so natural disasters like hurricanes and climate change and wildfires. But it also kind of speaks to this interesting vector where capitalism itself is always perpetually in crisis, right? I mean, this is one of the essential functions of capitalism, is that it engenders crisis so that profit can continue unabated. And so I'm kind of curious, you were just talking, Faye, about this idea that these different leftist organizations with distinct ideological framings or perspectives would be able to band together during this moment of crisis. And so I want to present maybe a particular thought that's kind of floated around in my brain for a little bit here, but this idea that, if it's true that these crises engender collaboration between ideologically distinct groups, what's to stop us from recognizing that capitalism itself is a ongoing crisis, and then to apply that same logic to build faster bonds between us and our allies and coalition build and continue to do the hard work of building socialism or communism or anarchism or, again, whatever your particular brand of leftist ideology might be. I'm curious if you guys think, there's overlap there, or if there's distinctions that I'm not seeing.
I think if I knew the way to get everybody to set aside their differences and work together to build socialism, then that would be one thing. Unfortunately, I don't know.
Ooh, you ain't wrong.
But the thing about socialism and socialists in disaster situations is what really helps people come together in those situations is the lack of state control, the breakdown of the accepted ways of how the world under capitalism is supposed to work. In the absence of that sort of dominating ideology and dominating structure imposed by the state, that's really when socialists can experiment with their own forms of organization outside of that. So I think it's really when socialists have to organize within the confines of what the state deems acceptable and what the state deems appropriate, that really puts a lot of difficulty on our organizing. And instead of spending time talking about how can we help people's lives, we spend a lot of time talking about how can we fight the state and what strategies are applicable there. In the absence of a state is when we're really able to get together without those concerns, or at least to a much lesser degree, and really talk about what can we do to help people, what can we do to build systems that meet people's needs, which is the thing that's really important. Obviously, dealing with the state in the meantime is also important, and dealing with the capitalist system, but, a disaster does provide a unique opportunity in that regard.
Yeah, totally. Well said. Oso, do you have any thoughts?
My own personal experience with other tendencies and ideologies within the left is that once you start actually, meeting in person and organizing in person with different positions in leftist ideologies, you really kind of get to the human portion of it, right? And you start to realize that we're working towards the same or very similar goals, and as far as like disaster response goes, like, basically we're all here to help someone. We have to give up some of these sectarian boundaries so that we can reach the goals that we're really after.
Yeah, for sure. I think in the immediacy too of this kind of struggle, there is this particularity that comes from the immediacy of the disaster, right? I mean, like, seeing downed landlines, seeing downed, trees, seeing the debris that just litters the roadways. There's something very obvious about it, about the catastrophe that capitalism itself as an economic system does such an ingenious job of obfuscating through its mechanisms, right? Yes, we can say that capitalism is a daily disaster, but it's packaged in such a way that it makes it far more palatable than something like a hurricane or a wildfire or an earthquake. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I also want to make sure before we part ways, at least for this first half of our conversation, what do you two identify as unique ways for listeners to kind of get involved before these nightmare scenarios might happen? They are increasingly becoming all too common. So what are things that people can do right now in order to try and mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis in their particular neighborhood?
Well, disaster preparedness is very important. Depending on the exact disasters that you might face, this will vary a bit, but generally you should try to have a supply of food and potable water that you have access to in case of an emergency, and obviously a flashlight, batteries, candles, anything else that might be useful in that sort of event. But that also really is sort of a narrow focus on like what can you do to protect yourself. If you want to protect your community, you should try to reach out to your neighbors, talk to your neighbors, find out what their life situation is, what things that they might have difficulty with. If there's a hurricane coming, for instance, it might be worth knowing if you have a neighbor who's maybe elderly and can't evacuate, who doesn't have anywhere else to go. Maybe you can take that person in. Maybe if you have a generator, you can, keep your refrigerator running so that you can preserve people's insulin or other medications. That sort of helping out your neighbors is really a core part of community self-defense. You're helping out your community. And obviously, if you're in a socialist organization, you should try and come up with plans for what your organization will do in event of a disaster. Is there some place that you can rendezvous? Is there some place, where maybe you can stash supplies that you will hand out to the community, rent a storage unit or something, or, some place where you'll have access to, even if the power is out. Just having a plan ahead of time, having people that you can reach out to, and knowing if there are any vulnerable people in your community that might need special help, that'll go a long way to mitigating some of the worst effects of a disaster.
Yeah, well said. And especially if you live in the southeast United States, where hurricanes can pop up like in a matter of days. I mean, that's what happened with Hurricane Michael. Having that infrastructure in place made a world of difference. I mean, it was the difference. I like to think it was the difference between, people going hungry and people having food, between people being able to get medicine and supplies and people having to go without. I mean, the more you can do right now, especially in the days and months before these types of seasons really kick off, the better. The more you can do before the summer, where these kinds of things tend to happen in increasing number, the better. Build those coalitions, have those bonds of community fellowship, and seriously, talk to your neighbors. We live in a really isolated and alienated time where it's scary to talk to your neighbors, but it's also really empowering when you're able to come home every day and genuinely wave to your neighbor and say what's up and have more than a 1 or 2 second word exchange with them, hi, bye. Being able to have a conversation with them, ask them about their kids or ask them about what their job is, building those types of friendships really can be an awesome way to be prepared for disasters when they come. I think, again, different people are in different ways. I know myself, I'm super introverted and I hate doing that, but there is an odd kind of comfort that comes from it when you're able to have those kinds of meaningful, deep conversations with folks who you otherwise maybe never would have had a chance to interact with.
Absolutely.
I sympathize with you, Pearson, about the introvertedness. A lot of people, I get that. A lot of people struggle with not having the confidence, within themselves to just go up to someone and say, hi, I'm, Oso, and I'm your neighbor. But we really have to force ourselves to do these things if we're a little bit uncomfortable with that. And I think over time, difficulty wears away, and you change,
Totally. It's like any other muscle. It just, you have to work it out, and the more you do, the easier it becomes. We got to put the social in socialist again.
Awesome. Yes, exactly.
Well, listen, before we end this segment, how can folks who are interested in the work that the SRA is doing with regards to mutual aid and disaster relief, what can folks do to get directly involved with the SRA's work?
Donate $1,312 whenever you can.
Yes, and big shout out to that comrade who did that for Florence. For Michael and Dorian. That was a very big help.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, whoever you are, you're amazing.
But in all seriousness, if you want to help out with the SRA's organizing, you can join the SRA at socialistra.org/membership. $25 a year dues. Obviously, that gets you access to all of our member range days and other organizing activities, our national communications platforms. So that's all great, but we do, when there is a disaster, we do try to organize at both the local and national level. If you don't want to become a member, we do raise money on GoFundMe or similar platforms whenever there is a national program. Our chapters will also often raise money to help out the homeless or for local projects for disaster relief. For instance, the San Francisco Bay chapter raised several $100s to purchase respirator masks, which they distributed to the homeless. Because in California's wildfire season, there's a lot of smoke in the air quality is really bad, and if you're homeless, you're going to be outside. almost 24/7 if you don't have access to a shelter. So that chapter raised money independently on their own and purchased a bunch of masks to help people out. And yeah, you can contribute to that. We always boost those sorts of fundraisers on our social media. And if you don't want to get involved as a volunteer on the ground, then donating is a great way to help. If you are a member of another organization like the DSA, the IWW, PSL, Food Not Bombs, whatever, if there's a disaster near you, you can feel free to reach out to SRA National Leadership. You can email us at president@socialistra.org to reach Alex, or you can reach me at vicepresident.socialistra.org. And and we'll see what we can do to organize a response if there isn't one already. And if there is, we'll try to put you in touch with the organizers closest to you.
Hell yeah. Awesome. Well, we will be back with part 2 next week. So until then, thanks y'all so much.
Solidarity.
Love and solidarity.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.
Coffee with Comrades is brought to you by the letter A, K, and the number 47.